$5 million. We need $5 million by Friday, or the bank is foreclosing on the entire commercial fleet. Those were the exact words my father, Richard, choked out as he sat sweating through his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. He was sitting across from my legal team in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan high-rise. The air conditioning in the room was set to a crisp 68 degrees, yet a heavy bead of sweat slowly rolled down his temple. Next to him sat my mother, Eleanor, gripping her designer leather handbag so tightly her knuckles were stark white. They were absolutely desperate. Their once thriving logistics company, a business they had ruthlessly lorded over our family and community for decades, was bleeding cash. They were mere days away from total, irreversible bankruptcy. They had spent the last 3 months begging every major bank, every private lender, and every wealthy friend in their country club for a lifeline, only to be politely shown the door. Their final, desperate hope was a notoriously aggressive, anonymous tech investment firm known only as Apex Solutions. They had spent weeks pleading with my acquisitions team for just 15 minutes of the CEO's time, willing to sign away massive equity just to keep their heads above water. They had absolutely no idea that Apex Solutions belonged to me. My name is Chloe. I'm 26 years old, and I am the sole founder and CEO of that firm. But to the two terrified people sitting in my conference room, I was just the worthless, scapegoat daughter they had violently kicked out of their house and into a freezing, blinding blizzard exactly 5 years ago. For 10 minutes, I stood in the adjoining private office, watching them through the tinted one-way glass. Through the heavy pain, I could hear their muted voices broadcasted through the intercom system. If they don't give us this capital injection, we lose the summer house. We lose the cars, my mother hissed, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. They will give it to us, my father replied, though his voice completely lacked its usual booming arrogance. Apex is known for aggressive buyouts. We just have to convince this CEO that the supply chain division is still profitable. Whatever, a third voice chimed in. Sitting right next to them, scrolling mindlessly on her phone and completely oblivious to the fact that her luxurious life was about to implode, was my younger sister, Haley. She didn't even look up from her screen. Just make sure my credit cards are unfrozen by tomorrow. I have a brand trip to Chelum, and I am not flying commercial. Listening to them, a cold, calculated calm washed over me. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was deafening. My father, a man who had once looked me in the eye and told me I was a worthless financial burden, was now sweating through his collar, begging for a fraction of the wealth I had built from absolutely nothing. They hadn't changed. 5 years of struggling, building an empire from a diner booth, and surviving on sheer willpower had forged me into titanium, while they had rotted from the inside out. When I finally decided they had waited long enough, I pushed open the double mahogany doors. I wasn't wearing the threadbare, hand-me-down sweaters or the scuffed sneakers they were used to seeing me in. I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, my heels clicking methodically and authoritatively against the imported hardwood floor. The room fell dead silent. My mother looked up, her expression instantly morphing from polite corporate anticipation to sheer, unadulterated confusion. "Chloe," she whispered, her voice trembling as if she had just seen a ghost. My father's face immediately darkened into a violent shade of crimson. Even in a room where he was begging for his financial life, his old, toxic authoritarian instincts overrode his panic. "What the hell are you doing here?" He snapped, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He looked around frantically, assuming I had sneaked past the receptionist. "Did you get a job bringing coffee to the executives? Get out, Chloe. You're going to ruin this. We are waiting for the CEO." Haley finally looked up from her phone, rolling her eyes in exaggerated disgust. "Seriously, Chloe, you are so embarrassing. Leave before security kicks you out." I didn't flinch. I didn't break eye contact. I walked straight to the head of the massive oak table, pulled out the heavy leather executive chair, and sat down directly across from them. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, and slowly slid their desperate, pathetic financial portfolio back toward my father. "I don't serve coffee, Richard," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, ringing out crystal clear in the silent room. I review acquisitions, and looking at these numbers, your company isn't worth saving. I watched in real time as the color completely drained from his face. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The anonymous, ruthless CEO they were begging for a $5 million lifeline was the exact same daughter they had discarded like trash. What I did in the next 30 minutes didn't just reject their pathetic plea for a bailout. It completely dismantled the toxic empire they had built, legally stripped them of their assets, and handed their precious golden child the ultimate, devastating reality check. And they never saw it coming. Before I reveal exactly how I executed the perfect corporate takeover against my own parents and exposed their darkest financial secrets to their entire board of directors, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing our community from all over the world. To understand how I could sit in that temperature-controlled, ultra-luxurious boardroom, look at my own parents begging for their financial lives, and feel absolutely nothing, I need to take you back exactly 5 years. I need to take you back to a time when they held all the power, and I held nothing but a mop, a stack of textbooks, and a desperate, foolish hope that they might eventually love me. The unspoken rule of the Thomas household. Growing up, the hierarchy in our house wasn't just implied, it was heavily legislated. My parents owned a highly successful regional logistics company. We lived in a sprawling, 5-bedroom colonial house in the affluent suburbs of Connecticut. Money was never an issue for Richard and Eleanor Thomas. Wealth flowed through our home like water, but the faucet was strictly, violently shut off the moment it came to me. Haley was the undeniable golden child. She was vivacious, loud, and perfectly fit my mother's image of the ideal socialite daughter. I was quiet, studious, and fiercely independent, traits my father viewed not as strengths, but as insolence. The blatant financial favoritism started early, but it crystallized into utter cruelty the year I graduated high school. I had been accepted into a solid, in-state university. I wasn't asking for a luxury experience, I just needed help with the base tuition. I remember sitting at our heavy mahogany dining table, the exact same type of wood as my boardroom table today, sliding the $4,500 semester invoice toward my father. He didn't even look at the paper. He took a sip of his scotch, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "I am not throwing my hard-earned money into a black hole. You want a degree. You figure it out. You need to learn the value of $1, Chloe. You've always been a drain on this family's resources." I was 18. I hadn't drained anything. I had worn the same winter coat for 4 years and bought my own school supplies since I was 14. But I swallowed the lump in my throat, nodded, and walked away. I withdrew my university acceptance the next morning and enrolled in the local community college. 2 years later, Haley graduated high school. There was no talk of learning the value of $1. My parents threw a lavish, catered graduation party that cost 3 times my annual tuition. They bought her a brand-new, pearl-white Mercedes SUV with a giant red bow on the hood. And without a second of hesitation, they wrote a $60,000 check to fully fund her freshman year at an elite, out-of-state private college. When I quietly asked my mother why they were willing to pay for Haley's out-of-state tuition but not my local community college, Eleanor just laughed, a dry, dismissive sound that still echoes in my head. "Haley is an investment, Chloe," she sneered, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. "She has a future. She has the right network. You're just surviving. Don't be jealous just because your sister has potential." The grueling grind in the shadows. I didn't argue. I just internalized the agonizing reality that my worth in their eyes was permanently zero. While Haley was rushing sororities, taking fully funded weekend trips to Miami, and swiping my father's platinum card for designer bags, I was drowning in a punishing, relentless grind. By the time I was 21, I was working 3 separate jobs. I woke up at 4:30 a.m. to open a local coffee shop, attended my community college classes in the afternoon, and worked until midnight doing data entry for a local shipping warehouse. I lived on a razor's edge of exhaustion. My sneakers had holes in the soles, so my socks soaked through every time it rained. I lived off discounted day-old bagels and instant ramen. I had no social life, no days off, and no safety net. But I had one thing they couldn't take away: a savings account. Every single tip, every overtime hour, every skipped meal went into a high-yield savings account. It was my escape fund. By December of my 21st year, I had miraculously saved $15,000. To my parents, that was pocket change for a European vacation. To me, it was my entire life. It was my ticket out of their house, the deposit for an apartment, and the seed money for the tech ideas I was desperately coding late at night. I kept that bank statement hidden like a state secret. But secrets in the Thomas household never stayed buried for long. The Christmas Eve betrayal. The breaking point arrived on Christmas Eve. A massive winter storm was hammering the East Coast. The wind was howling, dumping inches of snow by the hour. I trudged into the house at 11:00 p.m., completely exhausted after working a grueling double shift at the diner. My hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, and I just wanted to collapse into my bed. Instead, I walked into the living room to find the house brightly lit. The giant, professionally decorated Christmas tree twinkled in the corner, but the atmosphere was completely toxic. My father was pacing the floor, his face red with fury. My mother was sitting on the velvet sofa, clutching her temples, and sitting in the matching armchair was Haley, home for the holidays, violently sobbing into her hands. My heart sank. I tried to slip past them toward the stairs, but Richard snapped his fingers at me like I was a disobedient dog. "Get in here and sit down, Chloe," he barked. I stood in the entryway, my wet boots dripping onto the hardwood. "I just got off a 14-hour shift, Dad. I'm tired." "Sit down," he roared, the sheer volume rattling the ornaments on the tree. I slowly walked into the room. Haley looked up, her mascara running down her cheeks. "It's not my fault," she wailed to our parents. "The credit card company just kept increasing the limit. I didn't realize how much it was." The truth came spilling out. Haley hadn't just been spending her generous allowance. She had secretly opened 3 massive credit cards in her own name to fund her lavish influencer lifestyle. She had maxed them all out. She was $15,000 in high-interest debt, and the creditors were threatening to sue, which would completely ruin her pristine credit score and my parents' flawless public image. My father stopped pacing and turned to me. The anger in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating entitlement that terrified me far more. "Your mother found the bank statement in your desk drawer this morning," Richard said flatly. My stomach plummeted into my shoes. I couldn't breathe. "You went through my room," I whispered, the violation sickening me. "Don't change the subject," Alina snapped, glaring at me. "You have exactly $15,000 sitting in an account doing absolutely nothing." "That's my escape fund," I said, my voice shaking. "That is 3 years of me working back-to-back night shifts. That is my rent money so I can finally move out." "You aren't going anywhere," my father commanded, stepping into my personal space, using his physical size to intimidate me. "Your sister made a mistake. If this goes to collections, it ruins her financial future. You are going to transfer that money to her account right now. We will handle the payments." I stared at him, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of his demand. "You want me to pay off Haley's luxury vacations and designer bags, with the money I made scrubbing floors?" "Family helps family, Chloe," my mother yelled, standing up. "We put a roof over your head, we feed you, you owe us for raising you. The least you can do is help your sister, who actually has a future to protect. You didn't pay a dime for my tuition." I screamed back, the years of suppressed rage finally breaking through my ribs. "You bought her a $60,000 car, but you wouldn't give me $2,000 for community college. I built that savings account with my own blood and sweat, and you are not touching a single penny of it." The exile into the storm. The room fell deathly silent. Haley stopped crying, staring at me in shock. Nobody ever spoke to Richard Thomas like that. My father's face went entirely blank. He walked over to the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, and ripped it open. The freezing, howling blizzard whipped into the warm living room, instantly chilling the air. He turned back to me, his voice a lethal, venomous whisper. "You selfish, ungrateful little parasite," he spat, the words hitting me harder than a physical blow. "You have been a burden on this family since the day you were born. If you aren't going to contribute to this household, then you don't get to live in it." He pointed a stiff finger out into the blinding white snow. "Get out." Panic seized my chest. "Dad, it's a blizzard. It's 9 degrees outside. My car doesn't have snow tires. I won't make it down the hill." "I don't care if you freeze to death in a ditch," he said, staring at me with absolutely zero parental affection. He looked at me the way you look at a pest. "Get out of my house. You are dead to me." I looked at my mother. Eleanor just crossed her arms and looked away, refusing to meet my eyes. I looked at Haley, who was already looking back down at her phone, completely unaffected that her sister was being thrown into a lethal storm because of her mistakes. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I grabbed my thin wool coat from the rack, walked out the front door, and stepped onto the freezing, snow-covered porch. The heavy mahogany door slammed shut behind me. I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a loud, final click. I was 21 years old. It was midnight on Christmas Eve. I was standing in a raging blizzard with absolutely nowhere to go, cast out by the people who were supposed to love me most. But as I walked to my beat-up, freezing car, shivering so violently my teeth cracked, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought I would come crawling back, begging for warmth and handing over my life savings. They didn't realize that the cold they forced me into was exactly what would forge me into the woman who would one day own them. The frozen sanctuary and the mentor. The cold was not just a temperature. It was a physical entity trying to crush my lungs. When the heavy mahogany door of my parents' house slammed shut, sealing my fate on that Christmas Eve, I stumbled to my beat-up Honda Civic. The wind chill was 9 degrees below zero. My tires spun hopelessly on the unplowed driveway before finally catching traction. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew that if I stopped moving, I would freeze to death in the driver's seat. I drove blindly through the blinding whiteout conditions for 40 minutes, my heater violently blowing lukewarm air that did nothing to stop my violent shivering. Just as my fuel gauge dipped below the red line, a neon sign flickered through the heavy snowfall like a lighthouse in a dark ocean. B's 24-hour diner. I pushed through the diner's glass doors, covered in snow, my lips a terrifying shade of blue, and collapsed into the nearest vinyl booth. That was the night I met Beatrice. Beatrice was a 60-year-old retired corporate manager who had bought the diner just to keep herself busy. She had eyes that missed absolutely nothing and a heart encased in protective steel. She didn't ask me why I was crying into a mug of black coffee at 2 a.m. on Christmas. She didn't offer me pity. Instead, she walked over, dropped a plate of hot turkey and mashed potatoes on my table, and slid a set of keys across the Formica surface. "There's a small apartment above the kitchen," Beatrice said, her voice rough like gravel. "It's yours if you work the 4:00 a.m. to noon shift. Minimum wage plus tips. Don't be late." When my biological family threw me out to freeze, a complete stranger handed me a lifeline. I took it, and I never looked back. The bone-deep grind. What followed over the next 3 years was a punishing, relentless grind that pushed my mind and body to the absolute brink of human endurance. I wasn't just surviving. I was fighting a daily, silent war for my independence. My schedule was a suffocating loop of labor. I woke up at 3:30 a.m. every single day. From 4:00 a.m. to noon, I slung heavy plates of eggs and pancakes at the diner, smiling through the exhaustion for loose change. From 1:00 p.m. to 9:00 p.m., I worked at a massive regional shipping warehouse, managing their chaotic inventory logistics on the loading docks. By the time I dragged myself back to the tiny apartment above the diner, my muscles screamed in agony. But I didn't sleep. From 10:00 p.m. until 1:00 a.m., I sat on a broken mattress, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring at the blinding light of a second-hand laptop. I sacrificed absolutely everything to protect the $15,000 I had managed to save. I lived on a razor's edge of poverty. My winter coat was held together by strips of black duct tape. The soles of my shoes were so completely worn down that I had to line them with cardboard just to keep the freezing warehouse floor from numbing my toes. I lived entirely on diner scraps and bulk bags of rice. I didn't buy a single new piece of clothing for 3 years. Meanwhile, the digital ghosts of my family haunted my periphery. During my brief 15-minute warehouse breaks, I would sometimes catch glimpses of Haley's public Instagram feed. While I was taping my shoes together, she was posting photos from a yacht in Cabo, holding a $500 bottle of champagne, funded entirely by the parents who had left me for dead. The unfairness of it was a bitter, metallic taste in the back of my throat, but I didn't let the anger consume me. I weaponized it. Every time my eyelids drooped at midnight, every time my stomach growled, I pictured my father pointing out into the blizzard, telling me I was a worthless burden. That memory was high-octane fuel. It kept my fingers typing lines of code until my vision blurred, building the empire. During my shifts at the shipping warehouse, I noticed a massive, industry-wide flaw. Regional logistics companies, exactly like the one my parents owned, were using archaic, desperately inefficient supply chain software. They were bleeding millions of dollars in misrouted trucks, delayed shipments, and poor inventory tracking. I knew I could build something infinitely better. I used a fraction of my heavily guarded $15,000 savings to buy server space and file the LLC paperwork for a company I named Apex Solutions. I spent thousands of hours in the dark, writing a revolutionary, predictive logistics algorithm. But I didn't do it entirely alone. Beatrice, who had spent 30 years as a cutthroat corporate executive before buying the diner, became my quiet strategist. After the diner closed, we would sit in a booth until 3:00 a.m. going over my business plans. She taught me how to negotiate with ruthless precision, how to leverage corporate desperation, and how to strip the emotion out of a boardroom deal. When I was 24, I landed my first major client, a mid-sized freight company out of Chicago. My software optimized their routes so flawlessly that they saved $2 million in fuel costs in the first quarter. Word spread like wildfire through the industry. The snowball effect was violent and magnificent. Within 18 months, Apex Solutions went from a laptop in a diner attic to a sleek downtown Manhattan office. By the end of year 4, my software was licensing for millions, and my company was generating $12 million in annual revenue. I was suddenly, quietly, staggeringly wealthy. One of my first acts as CEO was buying Beatrice a beautiful, paid-in-full retirement home in Boca Raton. The woman who gave me a key to a storage room when I was freezing to death was now a millionaire by proxy. That is how you treat chosen family. The illusion of failure. Despite my massive, life-altering success, I made a strict, unyielding decision. My biological family could never, ever know. I legally structured Apex Solutions through a series of anonymous holding companies. My name was scrubbed from public corporate registries, and my legal team operated as the public face of the firm. To the outside world, the CEO of Apex was a faceless, untouchable corporate ghost. I kept my success completely hidden because I knew exactly what would happen if Richard and Alina Thomas discovered that the worthless parasite they kicked out was suddenly a multimillionaire tech founder. The same hands that had violently pushed me into a blizzard would instantly turn into open palms, demanding a cut of my empire. They would invoke the sacred, toxic bond of family to force me to fund Haley's influencer lifestyle and bail out their own failing business. So, I chose to stay in the shadows. I changed my phone number. I completely vanished from their lives. I allowed them to continue believing their narrative that I was a tragic, struggling failure who couldn't survive without them. I found immense, grounding peace in my silence. My self-worth was no longer tethered to their validation. It was secured in my bank accounts, my brilliant team, and the unbreakable life I had built from the ashes they left behind. I was finally safe. I was untouchable. Or so I thought, until my acquisitions director walked into my corner office on a Tuesday morning, dropped a bankruptcy portfolio on my desk, and told me that a failing logistics company in Connecticut was desperately begging us for a $5 million buyout. I opened the folder, saw my father's signature on the bottom line, and realized the universe had just hand-delivered me the ultimate opportunity for a reckoning. The trap is set, from boardroom to banquet. After I looked my father in the eye in that glass-walled boardroom and told him his company wasn't worth saving, the silence that followed was absolute. For a fleeting moment, I watched the arrogant, untouchable patriarch of the Thomas family physically deflate, realizing that his financial survival was entirely in the hands of the daughter he had thrown into a blizzard. He begged. The man who had once told me I was a worthless parasite actually cried real tears, pleading with me to authorize the $5 million buyout. But I didn't let him drown in private. A private victory wouldn't dismantle the toxic, public lie my parents had constructed over the last 20 years. So, I offered him a lifeline with a very specific, unbreakable hook. I agreed to acquire Thomas Logistics and absorb their massive debt, but under one non-negotiable condition. The final acquisition papers would be signed and announced publicly at the annual Connecticut Commerce Gala that Saturday night. My father, blinded by desperation and assuming I was just flexing my new corporate muscle, eagerly agreed. He thought he had survived. He thought he could still control the narrative. He had no idea I was building a public guillotine. The annual Commerce Gala. The annual Connecticut Commerce Gala was the crown jewel of the local business community's social calendar. It was held in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, a sprawling, opulent space dripping with crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and open champagne bars. Over 300 of the state's wealthiest investors, politicians, and business owners were in attendance, all dressed in bespoke tuxedos and designer evening gowns. This was my parents' kingdom. This was the exact crowd they had lied to for years, portraying themselves as brilliant business moguls and loving parents. I arrived discreetly, slipping into the VIP balcony that overlooked the main floor, flanked by my lead attorney and my chief financial officer. I stayed hidden in the shadows, sipping sparkling water as I watched the Thomas family work the room below. My father was completely in his element, laughing loudly and shaking hands, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. My mother, Eleanor, was draped in a suffocating amount of diamonds, projecting the image of untouched, generational wealth. But the most infuriating spectacle of the night was Haley. The golden child was wearing a custom, $10,000 silk gown, giggling and posing for the event photographer. They weren't acting like a family on the brink of catastrophic bankruptcy. They were acting like royalty. At 9:00 p.m., the dinner plates were cleared, and the master of ceremonies called for quiet. It was time for the evening's keynote speeches. Because Thomas Logistics had been a staple in the community for decades, my father had secured a 10-minute slot at the podium. Richard confidently adjusted his silk tie and walked up the carpeted steps to the grand stage. The spotlight hit him, and he leaned into the microphone with his signature, charismatic smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues," his booming voice echoed through the massive ballroom. "It is an absolute honor to stand before you tonight. We have all navigated turbulent waters in the logistics industry this year. But a true captain doesn't just weather the storm, he expands his fleet." A polite smattering of applause rippled through the crowd. I leaned over the balcony railing, my heart beating in a cold, steady rhythm. "Tonight, I am thrilled to announce the dawn of a new era for Thomas Logistics," Richard continued, his voice swelling with unearned pride. "We have officially brokered a massive, strategic merger with Apex Solutions, the premier tech investment firm on the East Coast." He paused, letting the crowd gasp and murmur in impressed approval. Apex was a titan in the industry. Securing a merger with us was a massive status symbol. "But I cannot take all the credit," my father said, dropping his voice into a tone of deep, theatrical affection. He gestured grandly toward the front table. This historic deal was spearheaded by our newly appointed Vice President of Acquisitions, my brilliant, beautiful daughter, Haley Thomas. The spotlight violently swung to illuminate Haley. She stood up, beaming, waving to the crowd with a practiced, pageantry smile. The ballroom erupted into enthusiastic applause. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Not only was my father lying about the buyout being a strategic merger, but he was also explicitly crediting the golden child, who had literally bankrupted them with her credit card debt, for saving the company. They were going to use my money, my empire, and my silence to elevate Haley to corporate stardom. It was time to pull the plug. The public reckoning. I gave my CFO a subtle nod. He tapped his tablet, and the grand ballroom's massive digital projection screens, which were supposed to display the Thomas Logistics logo, suddenly went black. The audio system let out a sharp, piercing screech of feedback. The crowd flinched, the applause dying instantly. My father tapped the microphone, looking confused. "Just a minor technical difficulty, folks." "There is no technical difficulty, Richard," my voice rang out, amplified by a wireless microphone I held in my hand. The entire ballroom collectively gasped, 300 heads snapping up toward the VIP balcony. I stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly down the grand, sweeping staircase that led directly to the stage. I was wearing a sharp, immaculate white suit that practically glowed under the house lights. "And there is no strategic merger," I added, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble steps. I walked straight onto the stage. My father's charismatic smile instantly disintegrated into an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. He physically backed away from the podium as I approached. Down in the front row, Haley froze, the smug smile completely sliding off her face. My mother clamped a hand over her mouth. I took my place at the center of the stage, looking out at the sea of astonished faces, people who had known my parents for decades, people who had been told I was a troubled runaway who broke my family's heart. "Good evening. My name is Chloe," I introduced myself, my voice calm, leveled, and entirely devoid of fear. "For those of you who don't know me, I am Richard and Aliner's eldest daughter. I am also the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Solutions." A shocked murmur violently ripped through the crowd. A prominent bank executive in the second row dropped his fork onto his china plate with a loud clatter. "My father just stood up here and told you a beautiful story about family legacy," I continued, projecting my voice to the furthest corners of the room. "He told you that his vice president, Haley, brokered a merger. But the truth is, Haley didn't negotiate anything. Haley doesn't even know how to read a P&L statement. She is simply the reason this company went completely bankrupt." "Chloe, stop," my father hissed, his voice cracking wildly in a desperate whisper. He lunged toward me, but my lead attorney immediately stepped between us, flashing a cease and desist order. "Thomas Logistics is not merging," I announced, ignoring him completely. "They are being aggressively liquidated." For the last 3 months, my parents have been quietly rejected by every major lender in this room because they bled their own company dry to fund a lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. Last Tuesday, they sat in my boardroom, begging for a $5 million bailout to prevent total foreclosure. I pointed up to the massive projection screens. On cue, my team displayed the official, undeniable acquisition documents, completely unredacted for the entire room to see. The exact purchase amount, the staggering debt ledgers, and the total transfer of equity were broadcasted in 20-foot-tall letters. They thought they could take my capital, bury the truth, and use my success to elevate the daughter they actually love, I said, my voice hardening into steel. "But I don't fund toxicity." Effective immediately, Thomas Logistics is fully absorbed by Apex Solutions. The executive board is entirely dissolved. Richard and Aliner Thomas are formally terminated, without severance, and Haley's fictional vice president title is permanently revoked. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. It was the absolute, suffocating quiet of an empire instantly collapsing in real time. My father stood frozen on the stage, entirely stripped of his power, his reputation, and his wealth. He looked out at his peers, desperately searching for a sympathetic face, but the crowd simply stared back in appalled horror. The flawless illusion of the Thomas family had been utterly shattered, leaving behind nothing but the undeniable, humiliating truth. The collapse of the Thomas empire. For a span of about 10 seconds, the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a vacuum of absolute, suffocating silence. The 300 members of Connecticut's business elite stared at the 20-foot-tall projection screens, reading the undeniable, legally binding liquidation documents of Thomas Logistics. The pristine, untouchable facade of my family's empire wasn't just cracking, it was detonating in real time. Then, the chaos erupted. The silence shattered into a deafening roar of overlapping gasps, furious whispers, and outright shouts. Down in the front row, the lead loan officer from the bank that had rejected my parents' extension just 3 days prior stood up, his face flushed with anger, realizing Richard had boldly lied to his face about their financial health. On stage, my father's survival instincts finally kicked in, but they were entirely useless against cold, hard data. He lunged for the microphone, his hands trembling violently. "Ladies and gentlemen, please." Richard bellowed, a desperate, hysterical edge completely ruining his usually booming baritone. This is a private family matter. My daughter is unwell. She is disgruntled. She doesn't understand the complexities of corporate restructuring." "I understand them perfectly, Richard," I interrupted, my voice projected clearly from the secondary mic. I didn't raise my tone. I didn't need to. The truth is always loudest when it's spoken quietly. "I understand that you fraudulently leveraged your employees' pension fund to secure a bridge loan last quarter. I understand that your vice president's sister expensed over $200,000 in luxury travel to a failing logistics ledger. It's all in the audit." My lead attorney, Mr. Vance, systematically walked down the front row, handing thick, bound copies of the executed acquisition contracts directly to my parents' former board of directors and top investors. The physical proof was undeniable. My father looked at the papers, then looked at the crowd. The people he had golfed with, the politicians he had bribed, the country club elites he had desperately tried to impress, they were all turning their backs, their expressions morphing from shock to absolute disgust. He was a fraud, and in their world, poverty was a sin, but lying about it was an unforgivable crime. The golden child tarnished. While my father was hyperventilating on stage, the reality of the situation finally pierced through Haley's thick armor of entitlement. The golden child hiked up her $10,000 silk gown and stormed up the stairs to the stage, her face twisted in an ugly, childish fury. The poised, pageant-ready socialite vanished, instantly replaced by the spoiled, petulant 24-year-old she truly was. "You're lying." Haley shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at my face. Her mascara was already starting to smudge as panicked tears welled in her eyes. "You can't do this. You're just a diner waitress. Tell them you're lying, Chloe, or I swear to God." "Or what, Haley?" I asked, looking down at her with absolute indifference. "You'll fire me. You can't. Because as of 5:00 p.m. this afternoon, the Human Resources Department at Apex Solutions officially terminated your employment." "You can't fire me. I own equity." "You own nothing," I corrected her, pulling a single sheet of paper from my jacket pocket. "Your entire lifestyle was funded by company credit lines, which means, legally, they are corporate assets. Your black cards were frozen 2 hours ago. Furthermore, that white Mercedes SUV your parents bought you for graduation, they put it under a commercial fleet lease for a tax write-off. Apex Solutions now owns that fleet. A repossession team is towing it from the hotel valet right now." Haley physically stumbled backward as if I had struck her. The blood completely drained from her face. She turned wildly toward the front row, searching for her fiancé, a wealthy junior partner at a law firm who only loved her for her supposed trust fund and social standing. "Preston," she cried out. "Preston, do something." Preston didn't move to help her. He looked at the liquidation documents on the table, looked at Haley's ruined, hysterical face, and slowly stood up. Without saying a single word to her, he adjusted his tie, turned on his heel, and walked out of the ballroom. In less than 3 minutes, the golden child had lost her money, her car, her fake title, and the conditional love she had built her entire identity around. She sank to the carpeted steps of the stage, sobbing loudly and messily, completely ignored by the crowd. The begging and the blizzard. As the ballroom began to empty, guests rushing to the exits to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Thomas family, my mother, Eleanor, finally broke. She scrambled up the stairs, bypassing her weeping favorite daughter entirely, and practically threw herself at my feet. The heavy diamond necklace around her throat looked more like a chain weighing her down. "Chloe, please." Eleanor sobbed, her hands shaking as she tried to reach for my arm. I took a deliberate step back, refusing to let her touch me. "Please, sweetheart, you can't do this. We're your parents. We gave you life. If you liquidate the company, the bank will seize the house. We won't have anywhere to go." My father stood a few feet away, completely broken. The arrogant patriarch was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified shell of a man. "Chloe, I'm begging you," Richard choked out, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I'll do anything, just give us a severance. Give us a percentage. You have millions, you don't need it all. Family helps family, right? Please don't leave us with nothing." I stood on the stage, looking at the three of them, a weeping mother, a shattered father, and a ruined golden child. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no pity. I just felt a profound, grounding sense of closure. "5 years ago," I began, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register meant only for them, "I stood in your living room after working a 14-hour shift. I begged you not to steal my life savings to pay off Haley's debt. I told you it was a blizzard outside. I told you I would freeze." Eleanor flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. Richard looked at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. "Do you remember what you told me, Richard?" I asked. He didn't answer, so I answered for him. "You pointed at the door, and you told me you didn't care if I froze to death in a ditch," I stated, repeating the exact words that had fueled my survival for half a decade. "You threw me away because I was a financial liability. Well, today, you are the liability. I am simply cutting my losses." I turned my back on them. "You aren't family," I said over my shoulder as I began to walk away. "You're just a bad investment, and I don't bail out bad investments." The aftermath of accountability. I walked down the steps of the stage, flanked by my legal team, and exited the grand ballroom without looking back a single time. Behind me, I could hear the desperate, echoing sobs of my mother and sister, and the panicked arguments of my father trying to reason with the remaining board members who were actively washing their hands of him. The walls of their pristine, wealthy kingdom had completely collapsed, burying them in the exact same cold, isolated desperation they had once forced upon me. They had expected a desperate, weeping girl to quietly hand over her savings on Christmas Eve. Instead, they had forged a ruthless CEO who returned to legally and methodically take absolutely everything they had. Karma hadn't just knocked on their door, it had bought the bank and foreclosed on their entire lives. The silence after the storm, an ironclad boundary. The morning after the Connecticut Commerce Gala, I didn't wake up feeling triumphant. I didn't throw a party, and I didn't pop champagne. When I opened my eyes in my downtown penthouse, the only thing I felt was a profound, unshakable quiet. It was the kind of deep, grounding peace you only experience when a lifelong, suffocating weight has finally been lifted off your chest. For 26 years, my nervous system had been wired to anticipate the chaotic, conditional love of my family. I was conditioned to brace for my father's cruel insults, my mother's dismissive sneers, and my sister's manufactured emergencies. But that Sunday morning, as I sat on my balcony sipping black coffee and watching the city wake up, there was nothing to brace for. The monster wasn't under the bed anymore. I had bought the house and evicted it. Of course, a narcissistic family structure doesn't just quietly accept defeat. When the golden child is dethroned and the patriarch is stripped of his power, they inevitably resort to the only tactic they have left: weaponized guilt. By Monday morning, the fallout of the liquidation was absolute, and the desperate attempts to breach my walls began. My personal phone, a number I had kept hidden for 5 years, suddenly began blowing up with voicemails and text messages. They had clearly badgered my legal team until a junior assistant accidentally let it slip. First came the apologies from my mother. They weren't apologies for throwing me into a blizzard, of course. They were apologies for the misunderstanding. Eleanor left tearful, hysterical voicemails claiming that she hadn't slept, that she was having panic attacks, and that a mother and daughter should never be at war. She begged me to come over for dinner, promising we could figure out a way to reverse the acquisition. Then came the texts from Haley. Stripped of her corporate credit cards and her luxury SUV, the golden child suddenly remembered she had an older sister. Her messages were a frantic mix of bargaining and manipulation. "Chloe, I'm literally going to be homeless," she texted. "Preston broke up with me. I have nothing. I know we had our differences, but I'm your little sister. You have millions of dollars. You can't just leave me on the street. Please, let me come work for you. I'll do anything." Finally, there were the flying monkeys, the extended aunts, uncles, and family friends from the church and the country club who had ignored my existence for years. They flooded my inbox with long, preachy emails about the sanctity of family. They told me that I was being cruel, that Richard's blood pressure was dangerously high, and that holding a grudge was toxic. "They are still your parents, Chloe," one aunt wrote. "You have to forgive them. Family is forever." Society constantly conditions us to believe that blood dictates an infinite capacity for forgiveness. We are taught that being the bigger person means allowing toxic people back into our lives simply because they share our DNA. We are told that an apology, even a desperate, financially motivated one, demands immediate absolution. I completely reject that narrative. I didn't block their numbers immediately. I didn't yell, scream, or type out furious, emotional paragraphs defending myself. Engaging with toxicity only gives it oxygen, and I refused to breathe life back into their dying empire. Instead, I had Mr. Vance, my lead attorney, draft a strict, legally binding cease and desist order. It outlined, in cold, sterile corporate language, that Richard, Eleanor, and Haley Thomas were legally barred from contacting me, my employees, or any subsidiaries of Apex Solutions. Any attempt to bypass this boundary would result in immediate harassment charges and the aggressive seizure of their remaining personal assets to cover the logistical debt they still owed. I had a private courier deliver the documents directly to the front door of the house they were currently packing up to sell. I didn't forgive them. I don't believe that true healing requires conventional forgiveness, especially when the people who broke you are only sorry they got caught. Setting a strict, unyielding boundary is not an act of malice or revenge. It is an act of survival. I didn't owe my mother a dinner. I didn't owe Haley a job. And I certainly didn't owe my father a second chance to ruin my life. When the courier confirmed the documents were delivered and signed for, a final, massive shift occurred within my psyche. For the first 2 decades of my life, my entire identity was wrapped up in trying to prove my worth to Richard and Eleanor Thomas. Every late-night shift at the warehouse, every dollar I saved, every line of code I wrote in that freezing diner attic was initially driven by a subconscious, desperate hope that one day I would be rich enough, successful enough, and powerful enough for them to finally look at me and say, "We are proud of you." But as I sat in my corner office on the top floor of the Apex building, surrounded by a multi-million-dollar empire I had built with my own 2 hands, I realized something incredibly liberating. I didn't want their pride. Their validation was utterly worthless to me. They were incompetent, cruel, and morally bankrupt people. Why would I ever need a seat at their mahogany dining table when I owned the entire building? Why would I want the approval of a father who calculated my worth on a ledger, or a mother who only loved the daughter she could brag about? My self-worth was no longer up for negotiation. It was forged in a blizzard on Christmas Eve, hammered into steel in the back booth of Beatrice's diner, and polished in the boardrooms of Manhattan. I am completely, undeniably whole, just as I am. The door to my past is not just closed, it has been bricked over. They will spend the rest of their lives dealing with the consequences of their greed, downsizing to a modest apartment, and forcing their golden child to finally get a minimum wage job. I won't be there to watch it happen, and I won't be there to catch them when they fall. I am finally entirely free. The ultimate ROI, choosing your own family. These days, the holidays look incredibly different for me. When winter rolls around and the snow starts to fall, I don't feel that familiar, suffocating knot of dread in my stomach. I don't brace myself for insults disguised as advice, and I don't tape up my shoes to brave a blizzard. Instead, I spend my holidays in Boca Raton, sitting on a sun-drenched patio with Beatrice. We drink expensive coffee, we talk about the latest software acquisitions, and we laugh. Beatrice doesn't share a single drop of my DNA, but she is my mother in every way that actually matters. She is the woman who looked at a freezing, broken 21-year-old girl crying in a diner booth and saw a CEO. She gave me a safe place to land, and in return, I gave her an empire. That is what true family does. They invest in you when you have absolutely nothing, not just when you have a $5 million buyout check in your hand. I'm sharing this story because I know exactly how heavy it feels to carry the label of the problem child, the scapegoat, or the burden. Society constantly bombards us with the narrative that family is an unbreakable bond. We are conditioned to believe that blood is thicker than water, that we owe our parents our infinite patience, and that setting limits is somehow a selfish, unforgivable act. If you are watching this, and you are currently shrinking yourself just to keep the peace in a toxic household, I need you to hear me clearly. You do not owe anyone your future just because they gave you your past. You do not owe your life savings to a sister who refuses to work. You do not owe your sanity to a father who views you as a line item on a budget. And you certainly do not owe your forgiveness to people who are only apologizing because they finally lost control over you. Setting strict, unyielding boundaries is not an act of revenge. It is an act of sheer survival. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. Sometimes, the most empowering, beautiful thing you can do for yourself is to stand up, walk out the door, and let the heavy mahogany lock click completely shut behind you. The cold might shock your system at first, but I promise you, it will forge you into something entirely unbreakable. You have the power to build your own table, choose your own family, and define your own worth. And once you realize that your value isn't tied to their validation, you become absolutely unstoppable. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Reopening these chapters wasn't easy, but keeping toxic secrets hidden only protects the people who put them there in the first place. If my story resonated with you, or if it reminded you of a situation you're currently fighting your way out of, please leave a comment below. The YouTube algorithm loves comments, but more importantly, this community needs to hear your voice. Tell me, what is the hardest boundary you've ever had to set, and how did it change your life? I read every single one, and sharing your truth might be the exact push someone else needs to finally walk away from their own toxic situation. If this video helped you feel seen, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to support what we do here. And if you want more stories about reclaiming your power and surviving toxic families, check the description box below. There's another video waiting for you that I know you'll connect with just as deeply. Until next time, remember to protect your peace, know your worth, and never let anyone hand you less than you deserve. I'll see you in the next one.